Awesome. Good evening, comrades. Ooh, that sounded, y'all got dragged to be here. Y'all on timeout. Good evening, comrades. I like that. All right, welcome to our second class in Module 2. Today, we have the honor of studying Revolution in the Caribbean. The Caribbean's a very special place, and it may be because I'm biased, but to me, the Caribbean is a hotbed for revolution. So the opening song that we just heard, that's by a group called Boukman Experience, and it's the name of a Haitian, well, it is a Haitian group whose name actually derives from a Jamaican, well, born in what was called Senegambia, but he's grew up in Jamaica during, slavery, plantations. But he actually led the 1791 uprising, which then turned into the Haitian Revolution. So shout out to the Haitian Revolution, shout out to 1804 books, because really, the Haitian Revolution was a victory that really spurred uprisings, not only in the region, but across the world. When I tell you everybody was learning and studying from Haiti, everybody was learning and studying from Haiti, from Simon Bolivar to Nat Turner here in the US. The Haitian Revolution gave so many lessons and inspiration to millions of people worldwide. So of course, we have to study revolution in the Caribbean. If we want to study how to make revolution, we have to study Cuba, we have to study Haiti, we have to study Grenada, and we have to study these historic processes that really led to transformation in the region. So I'm really excited. I'm excited to introduce Manolo de los Santos, who is the executive director of the People's Forum and a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and also a dear comrade. But before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So one, Zoom comrades, hello. Remember, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. And the chat, if you have any related course material, feel free to share there. Also, we sent out the Telegram chats by region, so feel free to use those as a resource for discussion during or after the class. For my comrades in person, the bathroom is right there. Masks are available at the front desk. And when it comes time for question and answer, please raise your hand, and I'll have two comrades, Gabby and James, who will be helping us run mic. So just wait for someone to bring you a mic so that our comrades online can hear. Sound good? Are we excited to study the Caribbean? All right. Thank you, Manolo.
Here we are. Hello, comrades. Hello. How's everyone doing? Exciting to see you all ready for class. I feel like Saidi and me are both biased because we're both from the Caribbean. But who else is from the Caribbean here? Okay, awesome. We're in good company, rebellious company. But for today, I wanted to begin the class by clarifying something. We're not doing a class on the Haitian Revolution or on the Cuban Revolution or on the Grenadian Revolution. That would require classes of their own for at least 2 years each to fully understand the contours, the twists and turns, the ebbs and flows of these revolutionary processes and what they give us as lessons. But today I want to focus, because we have essentially like an hour to talk and share and then open up for debate, on an interesting concept that I want to push among our current here, which is that we're not talking about multiple revolutions, but we're talking about one continuous revolutionary process in the Caribbean. A revolutionary process that some people could say starts in 1791. Some people might give it other starting dates. But I would say that the Caribbean has always been in constant resistance for as long as there's been a process of colonization and imperialism afterwards. And in this process of resistance, our people of the Caribbean, diverse, divided many times among different islands, among different languages, among different ethnic and racial groups, have come together at specific junctures in our history to transform that history itself. And I really want to recommend the main reading for this class is the Second Declaration of Havana, which is a unique document. You could almost say it was a document written collectively or prepared collectively in 1962 by the Cuban revolutionaries, but that had the input of revolutionaries from across the Caribbean and Latin America who wanted to give a very precise analysis of where we were coming from and where we want to go. So if you haven't read it yet, I strongly recommend that you leave this class with the commitment to read that text, because it is, in my opinion, one of the fundamental texts of the Caribbean Revolution. So let's start. What are our objectives? Every class has to have objectives. We're not here simply to study. If you want to just study for the sake of study, you're going to become a library in your own head. And that is not very useful to us. We have to answer certain questions. Who makes history? Who? The winners? That's maybe an answer to another question, which is who writes history? But those are two very important political and ideological questions. But I want to get an answer by the end of this class on who makes history. And I want to share something that an old Marxism professor of mine in Cuba, since the New York Post likes to say in the Wall Street Journal that I was trained in Cuba to do very malicious things. One of the most important lessons I learned from that malicious revolution was that all victorious revolutions are the legacy of every failed revolution that comes before it. So therefore, we have to look at historical context. We want to look at the concrete conditions that made these eruptions in history possible. And we want to look basically at what have been the strategy and tactics of these revolutionary processes along history. But understanding this all in one very clear concept, which we have to carry with us beyond this class, which is internationalism. Internationalism has many definitions. I'm sure each and every one of you has a different definition. But if there's one that I want to leave with you today, is this: that internationalism is not a belief. It's also not a choice. Internationalism is having a concrete understanding of the international correlation of forces and having the capacity to build unity of our class to defeat the ruling class. That is internationalism if you had to reduce it to a little clip. And to frame us, I wanted to share this important author from the Caribbean, Juan Bosch. He was born in the Dominican Republic, and he was a revolutionary in the Caribbean who, in the 60s, became president of the Dominican Republic after one of our many dictatorships. And in 7 months, he was overthrown by the U.S. government. And after he was overthrown by the U.S. government, the best thing happened to him. He became a Marxist. And he started to study the history. He started to try to understand why is it that the U.S. keeps interrupting our history. And he wrote this great book called From Christopher Columbus to Fidel Castro, The Caribbean as an Imperial Border. At the same time, because Caribbean people are like this great man from Trinidad, Eric Williams, was writing the exact same book. From Columbus to Castro, The History of the Caribbean. I strongly recommend, the Juan Bosch book is harder to find in English, but the Eric Williams is available in English for everyone to read. It's a great way to understand the history of our region. And a concept that both Eric Williams and Juan Bosch brought forth is that the history of the Caribbean can be summarized in many different ways. On one part, it is the history of different empires, European empires, struggling against the peoples of the region to take away their natural resources, their rich lands, to take away the lives of the people themselves, to enslave them. It is also, in part, the history of how these empires have fought against each other, using the territory of the Caribbean as a main battleground to play these things out. But finally, and more importantly, Juan and Eric make a very key, incisive contribution. Ultimately, the history of the Caribbean is a history of its own people to free themselves from their imperial masters. Again, the question that we're going to keep asking throughout this class, who makes history? The people make history. The class struggle itself is the motor of all history. There is no history without the contradictions between the fights, the issues, the struggle between those who want to dominate and those who refuse to be dominated. And how this plays out in the Caribbean is very interesting. I want to share this first map. I hope we all recognize more or less the region of the Caribbean. This is a map based on what the Caribbean, how the Caribbean would have looked like in the 18th century. And I choose this map because, in a way, it shows something that we want to zero in. Commerce, trade. Why is the Caribbean so important for the empires? Why does it ultimately play a particular role in the transformation of history as we know it? And sadly, we're not actually going to start here. We're going to start with these silly Europeans who, going back into antiquity, or what they call antiquity, their antiquity, and very much into the 18th and 19th century, had a serious trade deficit. They had this intense desire to constantly buy things from Asia. Spices, finished products, commercial goods. But the Europeans had a serious problem. They had nothing to pay for it with. In fact, the Europeans would show up to the imperial courts in China, or India, or Japan, and these people in Asia would be, we're giving you silk, we're giving you spices, and you want to give us trinkets? Little glasses and little mirrors? We invented that 1,000 years ago. And this created a huge problem for the Europeans. It came to the point that Asian products, for example, like Indian cotton, was much more accessible, much cheaper, and higher quality than anything that the Europeans could produce themselves. And this trade deficit eventually forced the Europeans to try to find commercial advantages or trade advantages in relationship to Asia. You know this guy Columbus? That was part of the trip to find out commercial advantage. They had to find out new routes to Asia. But what ultimately they learned on this journey was that the Caribbean, but Latin America as a whole, could essentially become a new Asia without the Asian problem. Latin America and the Caribbean could be the place where they could find all the spices, all the precious metals, in vast quantities without actually having to pay the Asians for it. They could take it by force. And thus, we enter a new period of what we call colonialism, in which the different empires of Europe, and not just the empires, even the so-called republics of Europe at this time, fight with each other to try to take as much as control of these natural resources in this period. This, in fact, leads to a big problem. That when, in a sense, they solve their Asia problem, they have a new source of resources, but they lacked a population that they could actually coerce to actually extract these natural resources. So what do? Any idea? 12.5 million enslaved Africans are deported from the western coast of the African continent and brought to the Caribbean and to the Americas. And in a sense, something new is created. Commodity chains, which is a concept that in reality doesn't get used much later in history, but in reality, the concept gets born here. And that's what this map begins to display. In one direction, you see, I don't know if I can actually, we can actually see the routes of slave trade coming into the region. The Caribbean would be a main stopping port, whether it was Santo Domingo at first, then it became Havana, where hundreds of thousands of slaves would stop and then be shipped off to different parts of the region. But in the other direction, what would go? Sugar, coffee, tobacco, gold, silver, and every possible form of natural resources. And this commodity chain required many things. Well, one is that this commodity chain produced immense profits for the Europeans. But it had a chain, literally, in which there were financiers, people who provided credit, people who had to produce taxes, people who had to run the ports from which these things came and left in Europe, the people who ran the ships, the people who refined or finished the products based on the natural resources of the Caribbean, and then the merchants and the retailers who then distributed all across Europe and then North America. Again, none of this is possible without 12.5 million enslaved Africans who become the producers of this great wealth for Europe. And without this great wealth, Europe would have been stuck in the feudal ages in dire poverty, unable to trade with Asia and unable to trade with anyone else for hundreds of more years. In essence, this was the Kickstarter for capitalism. And among this commodity chain in the Caribbean, one colony in particular stands out to us. Santo Domingo. It was the world's most productive colony. It was the engine of the economy of the French Empire. And it was, in fact, at its high point, the largest market for the European slave trade. In fact, the French coined the term that we, for some reason, keep using, even though it has horrible origins, which is that we love to refer to Haiti today as the pearl of the Antilles, or the pearl of the Caribbean. This is a French concept, a French slogan. They called it the pearl because it was the one thing that produced worth for them, produced value for them at all cost. And they clutched it, like literally people clutched their pearls. Something that they would refuse to let go. And this French colony of Santo Domingo, as the most lucrative colony in the world, producing coffee, sugar, cotton, you name it, had to employ at least 500,000 enslaved Africans whose blood and sweat every day over a short span of their lives, because enslaved Africans in Haiti did not last very long. Many of them did not pass the age of 35. Helped to produce the wealth that filled the treasuries of the French Empire. 60% of the coffee in the world consumed by the Europeans produced in Haiti. 40% of the sugar produced in Santo Domingo. All of this on about 8,000 plantations spread across this small section of the island. At its peak in the 18th century, Saint-Domingue, as a colony, had created a tax base of over 1 billion livres, which was the currency, the French currency at the time. 1 billion. And the assessed value of the goods, of the natural resources that the enslaved people were producing and were sending back to France annually was worth about 150 to 170 million livres. Again, what sustains this type of system? A system which, by the way, in Haiti, in the colony of Saint-Domingue, was among the most industrialized of its time. The French colonial regime, in order to increase productivity, introduced a whole series of new machinery, which at this time were kind of beyond the thought of most people around the world. Machinery that even didn't exist back home in France in many places, but that helped to increase the productivity of the island. All of this was enforced by a very strict class system on the island. A system that some would say was even more extreme than the one back home. The largest class of people were the enslaved African people. 90% of the island's population were enslaved Africans. This 90%, the majority of them were born in Africa, meaning by the moment of the Haitian Revolution, the majority of them are still connected to their African homeland with language, with culture, and so on. But at the top of this social system, can you guess who was at the top? Any ideas who? The plantation owners. What they called the Grand Blancs, or the Great Whites. Funny name, huh? And this group of Great Whites had the responsibility of not only ensuring increased productivity coming out of these plantations, but they had to ensure that no one would step out of line in this system. And therefore, two other groups of people were added to sort of keep the balance in society. There's always has to be a middle strata to keep the working classes under control. And particularly in Saint-Domingue, in the colony, two groups included the poor whites, literally poor French people who were brought to do menial labor, many times under horrible conditions, but they had the privilege of being white. So they were forced to do enslaved labor. They could get paid for their labor. And you had formerly enslaved people who, for one reason or another, either they were able to buy their way out, or they received certain privileges from a landowner who was dying and gave their freedom on their deathbed. There was a small group of free people of color. Oftentimes, these were the children of mixed race couples on the island. But this system, in which you had these four groups, was a system of constant tension. Because how do you keep hundreds of thousands of enslaved people quiet and docile? You all have any experience with this? No? No? You don't know what it is to be kept quiet and docile? Wow, you guys were thinking from the point of view of the ruling class. Wow, that's called hegemony, I guess. But imagine that in this point in history, in which hegemony isn't enforced through the media or through culture, this hegemony is actually enforced through straight-out violence. Strict and brutal violence. Violence expressed in every aspect of life. Violence expressed in families being ripped apart. Violence expressed in anything that went outside of or against the system being severely punished. Everything from hands being cut off, feet cut off, to death. But none of that could keep these tensions from constantly bubbling up into society. You had a problem. Everyone on this island was unhappy. And this is an interesting element to understand when we look at how revolutions take place. Yes. Everyone on this island was unhappy. The ruling class, the great whites, the Grand Blancs, were extremely unhappy because for as much as they increased the productivity of the plantations on the island, every year they had to pay higher and higher taxes to the French monarchy. They're like, we're trying to get rich here. And the king and the queen keep wanting us to send them more money. Money that we worked so hard for. Right? Have you heard that before? Then you had the poor whites who were angry at the great whites who thought themselves superior, and were angry at the free people of color, and were angry at the enslaved Africans, and who wanted a society where they would be respected as menial laborers and as artisans, as small merchants. Then you had the free people of color who knew that no matter how light-skinned they might be, or how free they thought they would never actually be accepted into the society of the Grand Blancs or even the poor whites. And of course, the most unhappy of them all, the ones who had the most to lose and at the same time the most to gain, was the majority of the population, the enslaved African people, whose political program essentially was centered around the idea of the abolition of slavery. And they continue to pose this political program in a series of rebellions time and time and time again. The Europeans faced a serious problem from the moment they brought enslaved Africans to the continent, which is that the enslaved Africans demonstrated time and time again an incredible capacity to organize. I mean, they brought organized people. I mean, you were bringing people from some of the most important civilizations on the African continent. People who led kingdoms, people who led armies. And in fact, the first slave rebellion in the Americas takes place on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1521. On the same island, but under the Spanish colonial system, just outside of what is now the capital city of Santo Domingo, the rebellion of Nueva Isabela. A rebellion led by two people. And see if their names say anything to you. Maria Wolofa and Gonzalo Mandinga. The Wolof and Mandinga peoples. Muslim warriors by excellence on the West African region. These were the warriors who built empires on the African continent. And the Europeans didn't think that they could organize in the New World. Big mistake. Maria Wolofa and Gonzalo Mandinga organized a large uprising, bringing together over 500 enslaved Africans together. And of course, the tactic was the same repeatedly, year after year, no matter what part of the Caribbean. Burn down the plantation. Burn it down. Fire will purify everything. There was no equivocation about how do you respond to a society that has enforced violence on you and that leaves you no space for your humanity or for your dignity or for any sense of freedom or identity. And these rebellions took place by the hundreds across the continent. In the Caribbean alone, within a span of 200 years, There are over 300 rebellions of this type. But these rebellions, as much as they inspire us, as powerful as they were, they all failed. In part because they suffered certain organizational challenges. And I say this not in the spirit of judgment, because we have no morals or no power to judge from this point in history. Especially us who have not even attempted a rebellion yet. We still have to get our PhD in rebellion. But when we get there, we can maybe criticize. But since we haven't gone there yet, we have to observe and learn, take notes, that among the enslaved Africans in this period of rebellions, many times they weren't able to cohere or build unity across the different language groups, across the different ethnic and racial groups of enslaved Africans. Sometimes the Africans of Muslim origins would tell the Africans of non-Muslim origins, we can't do this together. At times, they would refuse to collaborate with the free people of color who also wanted freedom. At times, it was simply a question of scale. They thought that by burning one plantation, they could defeat a system that on the island itself was made up of more than 8,000 plantations. And time again, these rebellions failed or weren't able to come to full fruition or full completion. But I believe, and that's what history teaches us, that our people aren't stupid. Our people are masters of history, masters of revolution, masters of transforming situations. It just takes us a little time to get it together. We are, after all, the largest class of people. We don't simply take up lessons quickly. But all the things that were happening in this period, which ultimately becomes known as the Age of Revolution, because of the profound changes in the economy, the social structure, and the culture of Europe overall, but in France in particular. Again, we're talking about commodity chains. All these European capitalists had built their plantations in the colonies. The plantation enforced labor on enslaved people who, living on site, had to produce all these crops and all these natural resources. All these valuable harvests were then sent to the industrial centers in Europe in order to be turned into what? Consumer goods. This meant that a new class of working people, of proletarians, begins to emerge in Europe, who more and more are working in little workshops, in small factories. And as this global trade system intensifies and grows and becomes a new system called capitalism, a new class comes into play. A class that, in this moment in history, believe it or not, was revolutionary. Was as revolutionary as we think of ourselves today. The bourgeoisie. This urban middle class that begins to capitalize on these new markets and to build distribution networks and to build ways of refining all these different goods that are coming in from colonies like Saint Domingue. And this bourgeoisie was extremely unhappy. They hated the king. Not only was he keeping all the taxes, but he was holding them back as a class from achieving their full desires and their aspirations. I mean, this is the bourgeoisie that is reading about, you know these guys, Rousseau, Diderot, they're reading the Encyclopedist, they're reading the ideas of the Enlightenment, they're excited about this thing about, people have rights, right? You know that thing. Don't look at me so weird. We know those things. And all this pent-up anger, both of the bourgeoisie that has these really intense political aspirations and a program, alongside the anger of the poor people of France, of the peasantry, who was suffering from having to pay taxes, not having enough to eat, and wanting a better life for their children, all leads up to a massive popular uprising, the French Revolution. And sometimes for us today, it's easy to say, oh, fuck the French Revolution. But in fact, the French Revolution is one of the most important revolutions of our history. It is a revolution that has to be studied in its own right, because it is a revolution that had a major impact on the history of humanity. In fact, everything that happens next is like a chain reaction as a result of the French Revolution. You could almost say everything, even the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, is a chain reaction result of what happens in France in 1789. It's not just white people history. It's actually the history of humanity at this point. And this massive uprising that overthrows the monarchy, overthrows the feudalism as a system, and brings in and fully affirms, not just economically or financially, but politically, the power of the bourgeoisie, creates a whole new series of contradictions. Because what is the main slogan of the bourgeoisie now? Anyone guess? What was the main slogan? What was like their battle cry? All men are free and created equal. Anyone else want to share? Yeah?
Liberty, fraternity, equality.
Yeah. Or deaf was the original version. They took out the deaf part now, because they actually do just kill us anyway. But originally, this passionate program and call for the freedom of all human beings, or so we thought. This, by the way, the French Revolution was not a piece of cake. This was a bloody revolution. I mean, you know, some of the most vivid images of what revolution means to us today come from this period in history. Who is left and who is right? The guillotine, chopping the heads off our enemies. All that comes to us from the French. We have to actually give them thanks for this. The problem, though, is that ultimately, the class that came into power was not the working people of France. The working people of France were the cannon fodder. They were the ones who put their bodies on the line to defend these new ideals. But the class that actually took power was the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie had very clear plans. They were like, yes, all men are created equal, except poor people, women, colonized peoples, and of course, the enslaved people. They cannot be free. Otherwise, how would we sustain our beautiful revolution? And, you know, the French Revolution was profound that it created this whole new set of contradictions in Europe, and they had a revolutionary army that went off into Europe to liberate the peoples of Europe from the monarchies and the feudal systems. It was amazing. It was like a revolutionary army on the march, internationalism on the march. They invade Spain, they attack Austria, they go everywhere in Europe. And all the imperialist armies, the colonizing armies of the period, go to attack the French. Creates this huge set of contradictions. But we're going to focus on one particular contradiction. Again, do these rights of liberté, égalité, fraternité mean anything to the enslaved people? And when the news of this revolution get to Saint-Domingue, everyone gets excited. Everyone is like, hell yeah, we're for liberté, égalité, fraternité. This is our slogan. The Marseillaise, the anthem of the revolutionaries, the Haitians begin singing it. They're like, every word in this anthem is true. We have to fight for freedom. But of course, the first thing that the revolutionary colonial power clarifies, again, is these truths that we hold evident have their limitations. Because of our class system, because of our political system. But it did not stop the people of the colony from debating and wanting more of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And in August of 1791, in the woods, deep in the forests of Haiti. I don't know if any of you have been to Haiti. No? But Haiti is a beautiful country. And in many parts now, it's been deforested because of US imperialism. But Haiti was literally the land of deep mountains and forest. And in the heart of these forests, there's a particular place called Bois Caiman. I say that name and I get goosebumps. Because this is, my friends, my comrades, where the mother of all revolutions is born. For me, the Haitian Revolution is the mother of all revolutions. The Haitian Revolution is by far the first of the true revolutions of our modern era. Because it is the first revolution of enslaved workers, of proletarians, of the majority of society, who organized successfully to change society and to change the mode of production, to change the ways in which people relate to each other in society and relate to capital. And in Bois Caiman, Saidi had mentioned, the Jamaicans always say he's Jamaican, but he was an enslaved African. Nobody at that time said they were Jamaican or Trinidadian or Dominican or Barbadian. Everyone was just, we're Africans, we're enslaved people, right? But Boukman, who had actually been traveling across the islands, talking to enslaved people, organizing enslaved people. Some people call him a witch doctor, some call him a religious leader, some called him a terrorist. He got called many things. But Boukman is an organizer at the end of the day. An organizer, or an organizing of people. And he sneaks at night from plantation to plantation talking to people. Going through different languages, dealing with the internal tensions of the different groups. You know what it is to organize people, right? What's the saying? You have 3 communists in a room, you have 3 communist parties? So imagine in 1791 having to organize hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. And together with Cecile Fatiman, a courageous woman leader, a mambo, a religious leader, a political leader, they have this ceremony in Bois Caiman. A ceremony which I would almost call like the first party Congress. It's like the Congress, the founding Congress of the Haitian Revolution. The first Soviet. In fact, maybe the Soviets should have been called Bois Caiman. Where they commit to unite against all their enemies. And to not leave not one head on the bodies of their oppressors, of their enslavers. And that this commitment had to go all the way. And they were committing to this because they knew one fundamental fact, which is that there was only one social class on the Haitian island that was capable of bringing this revolution to its very end. Yes, they needed to bring the free people of color. Yes, they even needed to bring some of the poor whites with them. But ultimately, the only group of people who could take this revolution all the damn way were the enslaved Africans, the majority of society. And they launched this revolution in 1791. A revolution that lasted until 1804 because essentially they had to begin fighting everyone. I don't know if you've read The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. I strongly recommend it. But they had to fight everyone. They had to fight the French, of course. They had to fight the Spanish. They had to fight the English. They had to fight the Dutch. They fought every empire known to the world at that time. And what was initially a fight to abolish slavery as the fundamental question, the fundamental contradiction of their society, they realized that even when they received abolition, so-called abolition, from the French Empire, this abolition of slavery could never be permanent under the French colonial empire. For as long as the island remained a colony, their freedom would always be at risk. And even though, the French did declare the abolition of slavery, I believe by 1793, the Jacobins in France, the revolutionary Jacobins, they formally abolished slavery. But Napoleon comes into power to the head of the revolution. And what's the first thing Napoleon says? We're flat broke. We can't have this thing of enslaved Africans, free Africans just being free now. They have to go back to work. And he sends a large army to take back the colony and to enslave the African people again. And in this battle, we lose one of the greatest leaders of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. I feel bad because I want to go deep into the history, but I don't have time to go into all the details now. And Saidi's looking at me straight on with, got to get to the point, comrade. But Toussaint Louverture is taken, kidnapped, and arrested, and taken back to France where he dies in 1803. But the revolution continues because the desire for freedom was so strong that nobody could bring down this rebel army. This rebel army, which, by the way, 1/3 of this army were women. 1/3 of it were women. And for example, when the French brought this army to defeat the enslaved Africans, they brought with them, for example, a whole battalion, legions, contingents of colonized people within Europe, like the Polish. Any Polish people here? No? No Polish? One Polish person. Well, imagine the Poles, who have been colonized by everyone and their mother, being forced to go to a colonized island to enforce colonialism on another group of people. What do you think the Polish ended up doing? The majority of them end up switching sides and joining the Haitian revolutionaries. This was the type of revolution, army, that brought down the French Empire. Even though Napoleon's army outnumbered the Haitians multiple times over, they were not able to defeat this young revolution. And by 1804, the Haitian Revolution is able to fully affirm its independence. In 1804, the Haitian people formally declare the creation of the Republic of Haiti. And I want to go a little deeper into what this independence meant. Because at this moment in history, there are many other republics that are being born. The French declare a republic. The US declares a republic. And in all the constitutions of the republics being declared in this time, there's one very important word that they keep putting in these constitutions. Can you guess? You know, the peace people don't care about those words. What's the one word they care about? Property. They all these constitutions guarantee the right to life, the pursuit of happiness, and property. Property being the most important of those things. And guns, of course, in the US. But the Haitian revolutionaries, in their constitution, they push something else different. Something that creates a new contradiction within this era, this period of enlightenment, of so-called enlightenment. Because they say, yes, people have a right to property, but people also have the right to enjoy and dispose of one's work and industry. Meaning, people have a right to choose and be paid justly for their work. Meaning, a property system that is incompatible with slavery, which is what all these bourgeois republics failed to achieve in the modern era. in the United States and in the rest of the continent, when they talked about republics, when they talked about new democracy, when they talk about bourgeois freedoms, somehow they found a way to allow it to be compatible with slavery. Which is why in the United States, slavery was in full force till when? Come on, did you all go to school in the US?
That's what happened. We went to the school.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you remedial history. Till 1865. In some places, like Brazil, it went up until 1880 something, 1888. Republics. But the Haitians go even further. And this is what really, really scared the hell out of the US, out of France, out of everyone else. Is that when Haiti becomes free soil, immediately the leaders of the revolution, like Dessalines, like Pétion, they immediately, apart from trying to get recognized internationally by other countries, they immediately offer support to all those who want to rebel. They say, anyone who is an enslaved African fugitive is welcome to come to Haiti and receive guns and ships to go back and liberate their people. The Haitians, who at this time did not have all the resources in the world, they are a newly liberated country, they send ships across the Caribbean into the ports of the US, even as far as Europe, with newspapers, with messages, sometimes communicated orally by sailors, Haitian sailors. Fight for real freedom. Fight for the freedom against the slavers, against the landowners, against the property owners. And they created an inspiration for rebellion and revolution across the world. In fact, in 1830s, the Greeks want to become independent from the Ottoman Empire. Who do they write to? The Haitians. They asked the Haitians for, can we get guns and ships? At some point, the Haitians even wanted to send soldiers to fight for the independence of Greece. Imagine that. Black men and women fighting for the independence of a European country. Who would have thought it? But this was made possible because of the Haitian Revolution. But they create even further ripples and contradictions within society. Because they define that not only would all these fugitives be welcome in Haiti, they would become children of Haiti, but they say to be black is a political choice, not an inherited identity. To be black means, according to the Constitution, I'm not making this up, according to the Haitian Constitution of that time, and repeated in many different constitutions of the Haitian Republic over the years, to be black means to reject slavery, to denounce colonialism, and to accept Haitian law as the law of freedom. It even went as far as the 1816 Constitution, saying that all African peoples, all Indians, all inhabitants, and their descendants, including the Poles, who resided in the Republic of Haiti, would be recognized as black. Again, black as a revolutionary political condition, not as an inherited identity created by colonialism itself. Haiti goes even further and says that to defend its freedom, to truly defend the abolition of its own people, it did the most beautiful thing. It invaded the Spanish colonial system right next to it. Now Dominican Republic. I am the one Dominican who celebrates this all the time. I love the fact that the Haitians invaded us. Because the first thing the Haitians did when they invaded us was that they abolished slavery on the Spanish colonial side. And despite all the contradictions that it generated, the Haitian Revolution had a benign and powerful purpose. other revolutionaries begin to flock to Haiti. Simón Bolívar, the father of our Latin American independence, in a moment of defeat, goes to Haiti and is asking for guns and ships. And the Haitian people say, of course, here they are, but with one condition. You actually have to abolish slavery when you achieve independence in the new republics of Latin America. A promise which, sadly, Bolivar didn't fully, play out. But those are the contradictions of history. Haiti became the sign of terror for landowners everywhere. In 1811, someone who was rumored to be Haitian, an enslaved African named Charles Deslons, organized a rebellion of 500 slaves in New Orleans. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, who was called to supposedly have lived in Haiti briefly, organized a rebellion in South Carolina. On the anniversary of the Haitian Revolution in 1831, January 1st, Nat Turner organizes a massive rebellion. And this became the story all across the continent. Everywhere, people sought liberation. A liberation forevermore committed to the question of abolition and independence. In my opinion, one of the most important revolutionaries that this country has given the world, Frederick Douglass. He wrote many years later that the Haitian Revolution was the original and most influential emancipator of the 19th century. That its dreams of abolition swept from Kingston to Caracas, from Rio de Janeiro to New Orleans, and that it was the insurrection for freedom that kept all plantation owners in a constant state of alarm and trepidation. He would go on further and say that we live in times which have no parallel in the history of the world. Our interests, our sympathies, our destinies compel us to be parties to what is passing around us. What an amazing revolutionary. But the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, despite inspiring this wave of rebellions, despite encouraging the independence of the Latin American peoples, still left the Caribbean in a particular situation. One in which, on one part, it forced the British Empire to gradually abolish slavery, an abolition that was Mickey Mouse abolition, half-half, wishy-washy, where the British government ended up paying compensation to all the landowners and plantation owners in its colonies in the Caribbean for the loss of their property. And you will see on some of the British colonies, Jamaica, Bahamas, Virgin Islands, the abolition date is listed 1833. But many decades later, you still have enslaved people working forcefully on the plantations. And to replace that enslaved African labor, something else happens that the British do, which is that the British begin to bring in indentured labor from India, from the Indian continent, and use it as a group that is forced to work in the worst conditions, but in many times forced into a contradiction with the African peoples of the region. But in the Spanish colonies, like Cuba, like Puerto Rico, slavery would go on for many more decades. But the spark that the Haitian Revolution had lit could not be ended. And in the 1860s, a period of great contradictions because of the US Civil War, which in many ways was a revolution in its own right, against the landowning class in the US South, the contradictions of Europe, the revolutions there. There is this moment in which Caribbean revolutionaries say, we all have to unite. We all have to unite and attack the remaining strongest empire in the region on all fronts. And together, the Dominican Republic, which had technically become independent from Haiti, but somehow willfully chose by the decisions of one or two, three leaders to go back into the arms of Spanish colonialism, has to launch a war in 1863 for the restoration of its independence. In my opinion, this is our true war for independence. But in Puerto Rico as well, and in Cuba, they organized it originally to coincide, to be on the same day. It was supposed to be on the 10th of October. But the revolutionaries in Puerto Rico were found out beforehand, and the Puerto Ricans had to start a little earlier. So they started their uprising on September 23rd, which we know today as the Grito de Lares. And in Cuba, the Grito de Yara, that is launched on the 10th of October. These three have something very particular that sets them apart from the other independence movements of Latin America. Something particular to the Caribbean, which is because of the imprint of the Haitian Revolution, none of these are simply revolutions for independence. They are also not just abolitionist uprisings, but they are revolutions that understand clearly that there can be no independence for as long as the system of slavery exists and human beings are treated as forms of property in a larger commodity chain. And these three revolutions, which are one revolution, which had so many leaders and so many faces, from Maceo to Máximo Gómez to Betances, and so many other men and women who gave their blood for the freedom of our islands, achieved and built over 10 years of war, essentially, great impacts on the history of the Caribbean. But something came into play that we had not considered. Does anyone know this interesting figure, José Martí? One of my favorite poets and writers. I love this man. Everywhere I live and work, I have a portrait of this man. This is like, to me, he's almost like a saint. Except he was not very saintly. He was a human being like all of us who lived in New York, imagine, and did a lot of crazy shit. But among all the crazy things he was doing, he wrote poetry, he wrote novels, he was a journalist, and he was an organizer. And his lifelong mission, since he was a teenager, was how to unite the revolutionaries of the Caribbean, and of Cuba in particular. And he launches, in the 1890s, the Cuban Revolutionary Party for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And in the last days of his life, in one of the last letters that José Martí writes to a friend of his, this is what he says. Does anyone want to volunteer and read this? Come on stage.
On stage?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotta let people on camera see you.
I am in daily danger of giving my life for my country and duty, for I understand that duty and have that courage to carry it out. The duty of preventing the United States from spreading through the Antilles as Cuba gains its independence, and from overpowering with that additional strength our lands of America.
Thank you. José Martí begins to warn the peoples of the region of a major problem: U.S. imperialism. And this is a moment in history when we're making a transition from colonialism, in which everything has already been divided. You know, the colonial empires divided everything among themselves, to a new moment in history, an era of finance capital, where these empires begin to fight each other Since they can no longer expand into new territory, there's no more new territory, they have to fight with each other for the existing territory. So the US empire begins to clash with the Spanish Empire for what they consider is their divine right to hold the Caribbean. And for the US, this goes back to the founding of this country. Thomas Jefferson was talking in the late 18th century about the need to overpower Spain in order to keep the Caribbean, because that was naturally part of the US. How Cuba was a fruit that just needed to mature a little so it could just naturally fall into the hands of the US. And José Martí understood the importance of Cuba and its revolutionary process for independence as necessary, because if the Cubans failed to reach independence, they would then be opening the doors for US imperialism to take over the whole continent. Sadly, José Martí is killed in combat a few days later after writing this letter. He was an incredible man, a fierce critiquer of bourgeois democracy, a fierce critiquer of US imperialism, of the US culture of violence, and a beautiful poet. I don't know if you ever get a chance, please read his verso sencillo, his simple verses. He writes in one of them, "I want to leave this world through the natural door. In a cart of green leaves, take me to die. Don't put me in the dark to die as a traitor. I am good, and as a good person, I want to die facing the sun." A man of profound thoughts and ideas. A man who would write, "There is nothing worse, there's no greater scourge on humanity than the enslavement of people by other people." Genius and revolutionary for his time. When Karl Marx dies, he's in New York actually in 1883, and he goes to give a speech. He actually wasn't invited to speak, but he shows up at Cooper Union, where there was this ceremony, this farewell ceremony for Karl Marx, and he, Caribbean at the end of the day, he goes up on stage, takes the mic, and says, "I have a few words," which turned out to be into a long speech. We are Caribbean people. We can't deny who we are, everywhere we go. And he says, Karl Marx, he was a crazy man, but he was a good man because he stood on the side of the workers. Because he organized the workers, he earned the hatred of the ruling classes. Martí was not even a socialist, was not a communist, but somehow he had this sympathy with Karl Marx. Incredible. Now I'm kind of having to rush a little bit. But I want to lead up to the Cuban Revolution, because this chapter in the history of revolution in the Caribbean, which, again, some could say starts in 1791, has its, in my opinion, its most transformative moment in 1959. When, in a way that no other revolutionary process in the past had been able to do, the Cuban Revolution was able to break completely with the forces of imperialism in the region. It was able to break with the past of colonialism. It was able to actually abolish real abolition. The abolition of the forms of capital that had prevailed and had enslaved the Cuban people for centuries. That's why I encourage people read the Second Declaration of Havana. It's like 21 pages. It's a long, beautiful text, but I love it. Because in it, the Cuban people say this: "This great humanity has said enough and has begun to march. And this giant march will not be halted until they conquer true independence, for which they have vainly died more than once. Today, however, those who die will die like the Cubans died at the Bay of Pigs. They will die for their own true and never to be surrendered independence." No applause for the Cubans? But the Caribbean people have an unfinished task. Our revolution is still incomplete. Our revolution has not ended. Why? Because to this day, more than 10 of our islands continue to be colonies of European and US empire. Raise your hand if you can name any of these colonies. Puerto Rico's the easy one. But can you name any of the other colonies? In the Caribbean? Virgin Islands. What else? In the Caribbean. Someone said Aruba. There's Anguilla. There's Aruba. There's the Cayman Islands. There's Curaçao. There's Montserrat. There's Puerto Rico. There's St. Bartholomew, St. Martin, both France and the Dutch. Turks and Caicos, Bonaire, Martinique, Guadeloupe. And sadly, we have to end where we start. Haiti, occupied again. This time, troops that have a black face, but serve the white power of imperialism. So we have an unfinished task. That is a task of primarily the revolutionaries of the Caribbean. Who are the Caribbean people here? Why are you raising your hand so low? Raise your hand up high. Comrades, we have an unfinished task. We have a deep responsibility. And our responsibility goes beyond one island. We have to be capable of fulfilling the dreams of our ancestors, who fought not for a piece of land, not for a piece of paper, but fought for true sovereignty and true dignity. That is the cause of national liberation. I want to end with that, and let's open up for questions. I know I've already passed the time, but Saidi is graceful and merciful, and will collect the questions.
Thank you, Manolo. All right, comrades, I am buzzing with questions, but before I ask my 3 million questions, I'm going to pass it over to y'all. Let's do maybe a round of some in-person questions, so raise your hand high so we could see them. Questions, comments, reflections, etc. And then we'll do some online comments. So I see some, okay. All right, let's start over here. Yep, right here and then over there. Either one. No? Okay.
Who's gonna go for it?
So such shy people.
Should I go for it?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Mario. I want to ask you something because since we concentrated with the Haitian Revolution, the way the Haitian finds themselves today, I mean, what a mess they got in that country. And the United States seems like it doesn't even, excuse the language, they don't even give a damn about their people. Where do you see this going forward in this 21st century?
I'm often struck by the use of the word America to define the colonized locations in the New World. I know that there are a couple of South American countries who have considered a new acronym for Latin America and the Caribbean. What can terminology do to liberate us?
I guess I was like very curious to what you talked about for when Haiti came to free the slaves in like the Dominican Republic, and why the Dominican Republic like fell back into Spanish like imperialism. So I'm just curious like what happened between that period, because it just seems like a really interesting thing that I'd love to learn more about.
Thank you so much. Gracias por todo. I'd like to suggest that we all look around and see that we can see, touch, and smell each other. Why? Because the Zoom people cannot, and they are far away. They're at different time zones. My request, please, is that we take at least 3 questions from the Zoom right now.
Thanks, Comrade. We're going to try and do a round in person, and then we'll do a round of Zoom questions, too. Let's take at least one more in person, and then or 2 more, and then we'll pass it over to you, Comrade.
Yeah, there are a couple there.
Yeah.
Gracias. My question is, sorry, my throat is sore for chanting yesterday so much. But my question is regarding the terminology, like the other person said. In the Caribbean and in South America, there are different identities. People, for example, from Barbados and from even Puerto Rico don't consider themselves similar. They consider themselves Latin American or even Caribbean in the same sense of the word. So are our struggles the same, even though our identities are not? That's my question.
Yeah, take me for.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the decision in many of the revolutionary contexts to employ violence. How should we think about that as a strategy? How should we think about how it compares to what type of processes we face today? If you could just speak a little bit about the decision and the usefulness or the strategy of employing violence.
Yeah, so I was just gonna ask, like when you were mentioning like about the initial rebellions that were happening in Haiti, you were talking about how like a lot of the time it failed because they were able to unify amongst like the different ethnic and religious groups and like these other like internal contradictions. I was just gonna ask, like, what would you say is the contradictions we face as a movement now? Like, what would you say the contradictions are that's preventing us from uniting as a movement against imperialism?
One more.
All right, let's take them. We'll condense them all.
Hi, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on continuing to promote ideas of internationalism today. I think social media and those sorts of things have allowed us to think in more internationalist terms, but I think maybe there's still a lot to do, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Hi, thank you so much. Every time you speak, like I told you before, I was like, I know you're gonna knock it out of the park. Something that I've been really thinking about since October 7th is this idea of international solidarity. I grew up in El Salvador, and so Jose Marti has been a figure that I've heard about since I was young. And there's this deep connection in all of Latin American solidarity movements that are just so embedded in each other. It's like you couldn't have the Cuban Revolution without the Haitian Revolution. And like in my context, in like the revolution in El Salvador too. And so what I've been wondering is how we can harness that same commitment to each other's liberation in a way that turns global. And in a way that recognizes that our inherent liberation is not guaranteed without everyone's liberation, and if that's even possible without the deep historical context of the Latin American region. Yeah, so that's just been on my mind and something that what you talked about really brought up for me.
Awesome. Let's get to it, or was there another one? One more.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about like the role of or the state of indigenous people during the revolutions in the Caribbean. Thank you.
All right. So, where do we start? I think the question of terms and terminology are always things up for debate. No terms are permanent. No terms are agreeable to everyone. Terms like Latin America are the result of violence themselves. I mean, why are we called Latin and why are we called America is a deeply complex and extremely violent process that has very little to do with our actual identity and actual coming together as a people. But if you were to ask most Latin Americans today, what do they identify as? Across the political spectrum, not just people who identify with the right or people who identify with anything else. Most people would say they identify with the identity of Latin America, despite its complexities. And most identify with it for one particular reason, is that it is an identity in opposition to US imperialism, which has tried to submerge and at different points in history over the last 100 years, tried to destroy that identity. I mean, we have to remember that, for example, it wasn't until that long ago that it was illegal to display the Puerto Rican flag. And it was prohibited to display or demonstrate forms of Puerto Rican culture. That at different points, with the many occupations of the US in the region, they intended to destroy our cultures. So there were many movements throughout the last 100 years in Latin America that use this vague concept that has really nothing to do with us, because we're not Latin, we're not of the Latin people, we don't belong to the Romance peoples of Europe in any way. We also have a name, America, that is named after the guy who named who did the map. It's like this weird, vague, and abstract thing that has really nothing to do with us, but at the same time, this vague and abstract creation has been given shape and form by the mass anti-imperialist movement. And in this moment in history, Latin America means something to us. When it comes to the Caribbean, even more specifically, there's even a bigger debate. Are we Caribbean? Are we Antillean? Are we West Indian? And that plays out in different ways across the islands. And it plays out across language. I mean, at this point, the four predominant languages in the region, English, Spanish, French, and Dutch, all compete with each other in terms of how to identify ourselves, and have very different definitions of what it means to be of the region. And that has always been the aim of the empires. To box in the English-speaking peoples of the islands, to not feel that they have something in common with the Spanish-speaking people of the islands. But if something has been proven in 500 years of colonialism, of imperialism, is that all the peoples of the islands, and not just by the islands, by the way, because the Caribbean also includes the coastal lands of Central America, it includes the coastal areas of Mexico, of Colombia, Venezuela. We share a destiny, which is freedom or nothing. No in-betweens, no half-seas. There's no middle ground between us and imperialism. History has taught us that lesson by smacking us over time and time again. We have no choice. We either fight all the way for our actual independence, the way the Haitians taught us and the way the Cubans taught us, the way the Grenadians taught us, or we accept that we will forever be simply the borderland for these empires, where they will continue to have their fights and use us against each other. And in this moment, and not just in this moment, but for the last 100 years, one of the things that U.S. imperialism ushered in was a new forced migration among the islands. English-speaking immigrants were forced to go cut sugarcane in the Spanish-speaking islands. Hundreds of thousands of Jamaicans, of people from St. Kitts, St. Nevis, from Anguilla, forced to go cut sugarcane in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican Republic, in Cuba. In the same way that hundreds of thousands of Haitians today are forced to go cut sugarcane and work in the construction industry, in the tourism industry across the Bahamas and in the Dominican Republic. With this deep desire to generate new contradictions among us. And sadly, we haven't figured it out. That's why we have an unfinished task, which is to build the unity of the Caribbean peoples. And there are many efforts that build towards this. Walter Rodney, another great and important Caribbean revolutionary who we all have to read, gave his life trying to solve this contradiction. Trying to remind people in Guyana that the revolution would not succeed if Desi workers and African workers did not come together. That the false division that had been imposed on them by the British Empire was what it was, a false division. So I say this all that these are terminologies that are in flux. But something that I wanted to raise is actually on the question of violence. I wanted to raise a quote from the Second Declaration of Havana. Whether this takes place peacefully or in painful birth does not depend on the revolutionaries. It depends on the reactionary forces of the old society who resist the birth of the new society engendered by the contradictions carried in the womb of the old society. When Fidel went to the Moncada, and by the way, TPF 1804 books, we just published this beautiful little book. I love this book so much already. We spent over a year working on this. It's the story of the attack on the Moncada, the attack that started the Cuban Revolution in 1953. The story of Aide Santa Maria, one of the women who led it. And then she, obviously you'll read it, but she says things like, we didn't go to the Moncada to kill. We went to the Moncada to die. Like Lolita Lebron when in the attack on U.S. Congress. We didn't go there to kill. We went there to die for freedom. The revolutionaries didn't choose the path of violence. It was the context that forced them to go down that way. When there was no other option, they had to pick up the gun. But that is a strategic and tactical question that is not decided lightly. And sometimes, particularly in our times of resistance, of armed resistance in Palestine, which we admire and we love and we salute. I mean, I wake up every morning going like this, Salute to our comrades. Salute to the men and women who wake up to defend their land and their people. But they didn't choose that path either. That path was chosen for them. So we have to be aware always in these debates, what is the context telling us? Is this the time for above ground work, or is this the time for armed struggle? In my opinion, this time is telling us we still have the conditions to do above ground work. The problem is when there are people who say, you can only do the armed struggle. And there's an even bigger problem when there are people who say, you can only do legal work. As if tactics were laws that cannot be broken. No. Each context, each moment will tell us what the right tactic is. Everything has its time and its place, said my Caribbean grandmother. There's a question about internationalism. How do we promote internationalism? How do we encourage internationalism? And Obviously, we have to promote it on social media. We have to do the T-shirts. We have to wear the keffiyehs. We have to promote the culture of internationalism. That is very important. The art of internationalism, this beautiful art on the walls, the things we do, the things we talk. This class is part of the culture of internationalism. But I want to challenge you all to do something else, which is how do we incorporate internationalism, again, not as like a thing that you just make a slogan about, but internationalism as the concrete analysis of the concrete conditions of the global correlation of forces. And then what is our role within it? Bring that into your actual political analysis. And bring that into the work that you have to do. Put that into your strategy as an organizer, as a revolutionary. Because that's where it actually matters. Sometimes in the US, there's this habit of, you know, on one hand, we talk about the Palestinians and how brave the Palestinians are. And then on the other hand, we want to do work for the Democrats. How do we deal with that contradiction? That it means that our analysis is not taking into account the correlation of forces and the fight that our Palestinian brothers and sisters are doing in the battlefield. We have to account for all these things. Not because we are simply in solidarity with the Palestinians, but because every time the Palestinians bring down an Israeli tank, the hit gets felt in Washington. And we have to take that into account. These are all things that are playing in the correlation of forces. How the ruling class splits and fights among itself over the question of Palestine is of great importance to us. Not just because we're in solidarity with the Palestinians, but because it will have an effect on what we decide to do here. That is the difference between our revolutionary analysis and outlook and those who just want to cosplay revolution. We're not here for dress up. This is the dress rehearsal for revolution, but we're not here to dress up. This is the moment for us to learn and to study, to engage with concrete analysis of concrete conditions. There was another question about trying to remember the question how it was exactly. How do we promote this sense that the Latin Americans have of complete soul and total solidarity among ourselves for total liberation on the planet? That is a complex question, my friend. Partly because I will be honest with you, even in Latin America where we have this intensity of shared vision and culture and identity, even then, put all the Caribbean people in one room right now to discuss what the plan is and we won't come out for 2 days and still not have a plan. Partly because the challenge always is, and this goes to some of the other questions, the challenge is not how to build a political project out of our identities, but how do we build a political project out of the shared calamity that we face, the shared enslavement that we face, our enslavement to capitalism. And that only gets built through struggle. And that doesn't mean not dealing with our identities. It actually means bringing our identities into the battle against capital. But that is a complex process. And that's why we're here studying a revolution, because we want to figure this out. And hopefully by the end of this course, we'll have some clarity on some of these answers. Because honestly, the fate of humanity and this planet depends on it. Then I really want to answer, what happened with the Dominicans after Haiti liberated us? Well, many things happened. And being very briefly, because this is also a topic for deep study, and there are many people who have written on this really beautifully. Every revolutionary process generates new contradictions. And one of the many contradictions it generated within Dominican society, even after the abolishment of slavery, was the landowners in the Dominican Republic on the Dominican side still wanted to own human beings as property and were refusing to let go simply just because of it. And they fought for many years on to avoid the Spanish colony from becoming the new Haiti. They did not want to allow the mixed peoples and the enslaved Africans on the Dominican side from attaining the same type of economic and political power that the Haitians had achieved. So at the first chance in 1844, a small group of patriotic but slightly misguided people decided to call for independence against Haiti. A Haiti which, by the way, did not react violently to this call for independence. And in fact, what happens next is that of the same group of so-called patriots, one of them, the greatest trader of them all, Pedro Santana, calls for Spain to take over again. Because ultimately, what they really were interested in was not independence. They were interested in maintaining the same systems of power and oppression and exploitation that could only be guaranteed by colonialism. And that is what happened to my little part of the island. But to this day, I am grateful to Haiti. And, when people say, Haiti's in a mess, Haiti is not in a mess. We have put Haiti in a mess. We have put Haiti in a perpetual state of agony. From the moment that France forces Haitians to have to pay reparations for their liberation, to the moment that the Dominican government and society lends itself every time the U.S. wants to intervene, to every time that the Haitian people have fought for their sovereignty, the U.S. intervenes by every means possible, that we've destroyed their economy multiple times over. And then we want to talk about, why don't the Haitians figure it out? That's why we have an unfinished task. We have an immense debt to Haiti. Anyone here who calls themselves a revolutionary has to be in debt to Haiti. In fact, my favorite revolutionaries like Chavez and Fidel understood this. That's why to this day, while the U.S. does this and does that and talks shit, the only two countries in this continent that have stood firmly and permanently by the side of the Haitian people at all times, sometimes with guns, and many times with doctors and teachers, and with real aid and real solidarity, have been the people of Cuba and Venezuela. I was in Haiti when the big earthquake of 2010, and all the media outlets in the US were competing to say which country got their doctors in first after the earthquake. And the Americans and the French and the Canadians were competing to say, we flew our doctors down first, the fastest. And the joke among the Haitians were, but the Cubans were already here. The Cuban doctors were already here. They had never left in hospitals built by the Venezuelans. So, there was one last question about the role of indigenous people. Well, we have to deal with another historical debt, which is that we have not fully ever accounted for the history of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. And there's a deep history of resistance, of rebellion, but also of a myth that was created and that all Caribbean kids were taught, whether we liked it or not, that all the indigenous people were killed and disappeared, which is absolutely not true. We have come to learn that that is absolutely not true. But we now have a task to unearth that history, to unearth the history of our grandmothers and grandfathers, of the Taino people, of the Arahuaco people, of the Caribes. Actually, one of the greatest histories of resistance is when the peoples of the indigenous people of the Caribbean unite with a group of Africans who had been brought as slaves on a ship but rebelled and then basically formed the Garifuna people, who are like the basis of resistance in Central America and on the Caribbean coast. These literally the people who have never been slaves. They fought and led a war against the British for I don't know how many years, over a decade. Man, our people have this beautiful history. We just don't have enough time to sit down and talk about it. But I encourage you all to read through it and go through it. Zoom questions?
Awesome. Yeah, let's take a round from Zoom.
Lots of questions on Zoom, and we're going to do some. People are asking for justice on Zoom questions. One of the questions
No
is about,
exploitation on Zoom.
one of the questions has to do with political education, specifically how do we effectively spread education to our comrades in the Caribbean in the same way like someone like Bookman would. And then another question was around the Black political identity and how this identity influenced how Black revolutionaries see themselves in the modern day. I'll give you a couple more. One explicitly around the U.S. imperialist current interests in Haiti. And then, well, actually, is that good? Should we give you one more? Another question around the continued revolutionary work on class struggle in Haiti and thinking about it in relation to Cuban and the Bolshevik revolutions, which we had covered the Bolshevik revolution on Tuesday.
Can you say that question again?
Sorry. Can you tell us more about the continued revolutionary work and class struggle specifically in Haiti in relation to in relation to maybe teachings or lessons from the Bolshevik revolution?
Anything else?
Sorry, there's like 40 questions.
Give me the juicy ones.
Okay,
Two juicy
they're all
ones.
juicy. Another question on the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico, how it isolates Puerto Rico from the rest of the Caribbean, particularly living under U.S. border control, ICE, Coast Guards. So the question is around how Puerto Rican struggle for independence might find support across the Caribbean, given the tight grip that U.S. imperialism has on and the isolation that it places on Puerto Rico.
All right. So, is that it? Okay.
That's it.
So, the task of spreading revolutionary ideas and political education in the Caribbean, that is a hard and simple one. Hard because that is an unending task, but simple because there are revolutionary organizations in the Caribbean. And I encourage you all to learn about them. From our comrades in Puerto Rico in Se Acabaron las Promesas, to La Colectiva Feminista, two revolutionary organizations on the ground, to the Communist Party of Cuba, the premier revolutionary organization in the Caribbean. There are many. Ofrane on the Caribbean coast of Honduras, Copin. I mean, there are endless organizations, and part of what we have to do is to learn more about these organizations. And maybe that's another conversation we have on the side as well. Interesting question about the question of the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico. I mean, and this ties into the question about Haiti as well, because what is the interest of the U.S. in the Caribbean? The interest of the U.S. at this point is not just the material gains it gets. I mean, the U.S. gets billions out of Puerto Rico every year. I mean, billions. I mean, it makes bang for its buck or buck for its bang out of Puerto Rico. It makes a lot of money out of this whole NGO industry that operates in Haiti. It produces so much wealth out of the enslavement of our peoples. The imposition of a free trade agreement, I mean, the list is endless. But the Caribbean holds a key importance that often is not talked about, which is its military importance. Because the Caribbean to this day continues to be the site of a large percentage of the world's commercial traffic. It's like us and the Suez Canal. It's like why the Mediterranean is such of strategic importance. It's what ties us and the Palestinians and the Lebanese and the peoples of the Arab world fighting for our independence. Because our masters continue to see us as sites for the reproduction of capital, for the traffic of capital. And in order to defend that, to defend their claims that they know are illegal and unsubstantiated and have to be enforced by violence, they have imposed on us dozens of US military bases. The most important of them being Guantanamo. But the other bases of great importance are all in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico gets used as the launching pad for all acts of repression against any movement for independence or revolution in the region. When there was revolution in Central America, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, where did the planes to go bomb the revolutionaries leave from? From the bases in Puerto Rico. Yeah. But you know what also happened there? This amazing group of Puerto Rican revolutionaries, los macheteros, the machete wielders, an armed struggle group on the island, bravely destroyed 12 of those US Air Force planes so that they wouldn't bomb their comrades in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. But Puerto Rico, like all these other islands, gets used as a military outpost in the region. Our islands are now being used, for example, in the Caribbean, to try to create conflict between Guyana and Venezuela. All so that the US can keep the oil. Because some of the world's largest reserves of oil are in that border region, in the Essequibo. The US doesn't care about Guyana. They don't care about the Venezuelans. They don't care about anybody but themselves. And not even themselves. They care about the rich people in this country. So we have to be aware of this constant dynamic, this feature of what imperialism means to the people of the Caribbean. Which means that when we look at the class struggle today in the Caribbean, but in countries like Haiti, but in Puerto Rico, we have to look at it in multiple forms. The class struggle that clearly expresses itself in the movements of workers for better wages, for rights, for the right to unionize, but also in the movement of workers who fight for independence. Even in places like Guadeloupe, in Martinique, which, by the way, are not even classified as colonies anymore, because they're considered overseas departments of France. Even there, you will find resistance. Of the movements of workers who refuse to accept that our destiny as the Caribbean is to simply be the playground for the rich, the tourist resort, for millions of Americans and Europeans to simply enjoy themselves, with everything that comes with prostitution, drugs, violence. That's the class struggle playing itself out too. And lastly, this is a tricky question, because I would say that the question of black political identity has been deeply transformed since the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution made a very clear point, which the US has sought to destroy from the very beginning. Because how convenient for the US to turn blackness into a question of racial identity alone. And how hard they have worked, and I'm meeting the US government directly, to divide black people in the United States from the struggle of people in the Caribbean who look just like them, but for whom the ship simply landed a little earlier. How long have they tried to divide us? What is the objective of that? What is the intentionality? And what is the ideology behind it? These are all things that we have to interrogate. And I wanted to close by reading a little bit of Aide Santa Maria. We went to the Moncada as disciples of José Martí. Today, we are Marxists, but we have not abandoned José Martí, because there is no contradiction in following both. We went to Moncada with the ideas of Martí, and today we continue with the ideas of Martí, of Lenin, of Marx, and Bolívar. Therefore, comrades, I tell you this, because we are Marxist-Leninists, we love our flag. We love our anthem because it is a fighting song. It was a song made in battle, not made for peace. And when I say peace, I mean the peace that we want. I'm not saying the peace that they, the imperialists, want to impose on us. We are Marxist-Leninists. We fight in a communist party, a true communist party, where our militants and leaders produce what the people need. Hey, de Santa Maria. So, comrades, it's been a pleasure being in class with you all. I hope to see you in the next class. Remember, and actually it's in the Second Declaration of Havana, the duty of all revolutionaries is not to cosplay, is not to play around, it is to make revolution. That is our task.
Thank you so much, comrade. All right, comrades. All right, please bear with me. I do have a lot of notes and announcements, but don't worry, this will all be sent out via email and telegram. Okay, so I'm going to run it through calendar-wise. So we're going to continue our study of revolution in the Caribbean. Actually, tomorrow we'll get to hear from comrades who recently went to Cuba to actually witness the revolution process. And they're going to do a report back tomorrow here at the People's Forum to share what they learned, their reflections, etc. So that's going to happen here tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, we'll see you there. Awesome. So that's Friday. Saturday, we're going to have our second Saturday dialogues. And it's going to be a discussion on media and the battle of ideas, which is a key front of political struggle. And it will feature a discussion with two militant journalists. The first is Alina Duarte, a journalist with De Raiz, and the second is Zoe Alexandra, a journalist with People's Dispatch. But when we talk a little bit about battle ideas, I just want to read this one quote. So it says, it's from Fidel. When a people is imbued with these ideas, when a people is convinced of these ideas, that people is invincible, and no weapons, no matter how sophisticated, can conquer them. It's Fidel. So we'll talk about that on Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That same day, we'll have a vendor's market right after and a concert with Carsey Blanton. All proceeds will go towards supporting the Middle East Children's Alliance. So we see you here on Saturday all day. Okay, you ready for next module? Oh, I think y'all are ready for next module. Great. So next module, we'll be studying how imperialist wars end. And we actually have a very exciting announcement. Does anyone know this book? Awesome. So this is the Trinity Fundamentals, and it's written by a dear comrade, Wissam Rafidi, who was held in a Zionist prison for 9 years. Not for 9, he was in solitary, hiding from Zionist forces for 9 years. So he's underground, and when he's in the Zionist prison, he writes this book, and there's a beautiful story about it. I recommend you check it out. But he'll actually be joining us, calling in live from Palestine to join us for our session on why Palestine will win. So, awesome, yay. To accommodate that, we're going to be moving the schedule around a little bit, so I'm going to say it here, and then once again, you'll get it on email. So Tuesday, we'll gather for a little bit of a mid-course discussion. And on Wednesday, where are we going to be? Awesome. We have the special opportunity where a war criminal will be visiting our very own country. And are we going to welcome him with flowers and champagne? No. We're going to welcome him with a people's red line and issue a citizen's arrest. So on Wednesday, we're going to D.C. We're leaving here bright and early. A bunch of us from TPF are going, so check in with any of our staff here. Get your bus ticket and let's go. Then we're going to come back, and then we're going to be back here on Thursday evening, and we'll have a session on how Vietnam won. Then on Friday, we'll take a little break. And then on Saturday, we're back for our session on why Palestine will win with Wissam from 1 to 3. All right? Don't worry if you didn't get it all. We're going to send it out via notes, via email and Telegram. Ooh, so many words, guys. And yeah. All right, are we excited? Great. All right, let's cue the music.
Thank you.